All right. So now what do we got going on in the late 80s? Tom, you already mentioned a few bands that are getting started, Solitude Aeturnus, a few others. So what's happening here in the late 80s as we start moving into the 90s?
Well, I mean, at this point, there are a handful of labels out there that are starting to germinate, really, but they're not actually putting out anything doom metal yet, right? They're still dealing with other underground kind of stuff. Uh, but you see Solitude. I think Solitude is a pretty important step because when Roadrunner bought the rights from King Classic for that first album, that Into the Depths of Sorrow, this is the first band that's taking influence from Candlemass, plain and simple. And and then While Having Wept is the second, right? We're like we formed within 1 year of each other, right? So we're the only ones actually pursuing this branch further because that's the stuff that resonated with us. At the same time, you've got these bands like Revelation, you've got Dream Death, which I'm going to leave Butch to discuss, because it's not quite Penance yet, but 87, right? Journey,
Yeah.
right? Is that 87?
Yeah, right around that time. I mean, those guys, really that record gets talked about in doom metal circles, but really and what drew me to them, and I think what's interesting about Dream Death is really they split the difference between doom and thrash. I mean, you got Brian, Goodbread singing like Tom Araya and them, even when they're playing fast, like they get this Celtic Frost vibe to a lot of the stuff. And it's in a lot of ways, I think that they were like a precursor to
Death Doom.
To Death Doom. Yeah, seriously. I mean, it was like really the first Death Doom record in a lot of ways. And that's an insane record.
I love
and
it.
then they kind of like, that falls apart. But then, the last lineup of that band is the first lineup of Penance. So, but then they make a conscious decision to slow it down and go, doom, like straight on with, but with this, it's the same guitar sounds and vocal styles, just they changed the riffing up. And so that's where, they're pulling into the 90s, the same time as Revelation and these other bands.
Right. And so I think what it's really where doom metal as a genre is official and in most aspects, where bands are actually identifying themselves as doom metal bands. It's that turn into the 90s, and look, there's a few other bits and bats that kind of pop up in the late 80s. And look, we've kind of overlooked a few things like The Obsessed and Sirith Ungol, things like that have been happening late 70s, early 80s. Those bands all certainly factor in too. But not necessarily in a pure doom sense, right? But very closely related, right? But it's around 1991 that doom metal as a subgenre is a thing, and I think it only happens for two reasons. One, because of thrash metal being distinguished as thrash metal or speed metal, right? And then so that starts the breakdown into subgenres, number one. And then again, Epicus, that gave us the name, doom metal and epic doom metal, right? So once we get into like 1990, 1991, here's what really happens is we have these fanzines start popping up, like Under the Oak, for example, Griff from Cathedral's zine. And it's featuring these kinds of bands basically almost exclusively, right? And shortly after that, you get Reflections of Doom from Belgium. And you know, look, probably the big thing is Dark Passages, the compilation, right? You know, because that's, you got like some stuff that was happening right then, like 1990, 1991, with Count Raven, Saint Vitus V, Solitude Aeturnus, and Cathedral, obviously, you know, that stuff factoring in. So you have like this first wave of doom bands. That's the way that I've always referred to them, you know, Revelations there, that kind of stuff. So that's the first time that you see any real association with the term doom metal.
Yeah. All right. So then let's talk about Brain Ticket Records and sort of the whole. Now, as you mentioned, now doom is becoming a subgenre. It's something that people are recognizing. People are putting out compilations. There's fanzines. It's becoming a thing. So, Butch, you want to tell us about some stuff about maybe the Maryland and that kind of approximate scene? Now we're sort of getting into what, like the mid '90s, that late '90s sort of era, and Brain Ticket Records.
Well, I mean, in the Maryland area, you obviously had you know, Revelation down there. The Obsessed is coming out of there, and Iron Man, and you know,
Unorthodox.
Unorthodox, yeah, Wretched.
Unorthodox, Internal Void. I mean, there's a whole host of bands cropping up in that scene. I don't, you know, Wild Heaven Wept from down in Virginia, and I don't, what's in the fucking water down there, man? You know, oh, sorry, I didn't mean. You know, and I think you know, when you have a scene like that where you have a bunch of bands that, you know, get along for the most part, and they're playing, and Tom probably knows more about like the relations of the, how the bands all kind of jive together. But I, you know, from what I've always seen, you know, since I've been involved with when I got involved with Penance and we started playing down in the area, was you know, a lot of those guys played in each other's bands, and there's this whole thing going on. You know, you had Hellhound Records, of course, signing bands out of there, and
yeah,
so I mean, it's a huge part of, you know, doom. All you know, you can argue that it's you know, it's a cult kind of thing, but you can't look past the importance of that scene down there in that little, you know, Frederick area, and down in that, you know, down in Maryland, like the whole thing going on there.
Yeah, look, where what it really comes down to is you had all these guys that were kind of on the periphery of the Obsessed and Pentagram. They grew up around them. They started making their own bands, influenced by them even more so than being influenced by Sabbath. You know, I mean, of course, Sabbath still factors in, but these are the people that were there going to the Wax Museum and these kinds of like events and shows to see these bands. So it's just like anything. Like if you have these bands, your high school bands, and all your friends see that and they say that they want to do that too, I mean, that factors in. You know, there's people that they're partying together. It's very familial, you know, and so that was a thing. And I'm sure that factors into Hellhound Records even before Brain Ticket. I know you mentioned Brain Ticket, but that comes along a little bit later. It's like,
yeah, I was speaking in error. I was thinking of Hellhound.
Yeah, like Hellhound Records in Germany, like initially was doing like these kind of punky, you know, quirky kinds of things, but you know, then they start dropping like Saint Vitus and Count Raven, Revelation. But then also they're picking up all the bands from that Frederick area and that part of Maryland. And I mean, I think it's important to point out that Revelations from Baltimore, they weren't quite, they were like plugged in and everybody knew each other, but it was like a different scene, kind of an entity unto themselves, really. And that makes sense too, because if you listen musically, you know, you got this more proggy aspect and all this kind of stuff compared to the other bands that it's like, you know, biker rock, you know, and Sabbath and, you know, Saint Vitus and this kind of stuff. But you got the Hellhound record stuff. You got Rise Above Records, you know, Lee Dorian from Cathedral, putting out Revelation, Salvation's Answer, and Penance, Road Less Traveled. These are huge moments, right? Because you know, I think that may be even more important than Hellhound in a lot of ways, because you know, at this time, like, people are starting to become aware of like Napalm Death, right? And the more extreme side of things. And here's the former singer of Napalm Death starting his own label and dropping some stuff. And then he has his own band, Cathedral, which is like the antithesis of what they're doing. These guys, on one hand, you got like Napalm Death and Repulsion and this kind of stuff, where it's like just speed, crazy noise, fast as you can go. Then you got Cathedral dropping Morning of a New Day, you know, where it's like it almost doesn't get slower than that at the time, right? So that's a big turning point, and it's like that's the point where you see that identification with doom metal, period. And yeah, after all that stuff, we see, you know, it's like the people that are directly involved. This is kind of the way it's been ever since, right? Is that you get people like John Perez starting his label Brain Ticket. You get people like John Gallo from Orodruin doing the Born Too Late festivals and things like that down the road. It's very, very much grassroots, right? And because of all these zines and other things, it's like everybody is in touch with everybody else. And it's always been like that, you know? It's like this extended family, and it kind of goes back to the Sabbath tree, right? Now some of us are more black sheep than others, I guess, but you know, I certainly never felt as like I related that much to the Maryland scene. Like, I mean, you figure WHW comes into play in 1989, and we were doing something different, you know. It was like basically us and Solitude, and then there was everybody else, right? And until you got to remember that at the same time all this time is, you know, what's happening is 1990 you get Solstice in England, you got Forsaken popping up and with Virtues of Sanctity in 91, Forlorn in Sweden, right? You got like these other epic bands kind of like popping up, and so that becomes like a thing that's happening. At the same time, all of the other more traditional doom bands are starting to coalesce, and it's because of the labels like Hellhound and Rise Above and things like that that it gets more widespread. And you know, like I said, when we started, there's 25 doom metal bands on the planet active, and in fact, at the time, Candlemass wasn't even a thing. You know, like 1990 Live, they went on hiatus, right? And you know, everything, it like kind of left this opportunity for a Solitude to come in and kind of fill that void in some capacity. But yeah, look, you could count everyone on two hands and 2 feet, right? But as we get further into the 90s, right, you know, you start having more and more bands popping up because of the tape trading, because of these labels gradually getting more exposure. And then this is also at the same time that basically everything that was slow and heavy started getting lumped together, right? Didn't matter if it was droning or if it was stoner rock or if it was slow death metal. They like people like Relapse Records and Wild Rags and some of these other cats that were distributing music at the time would just call anything that was slow and heavy doom metal. Whether it actually was or not is, you know, that's just, it was just a convenient umbrella term. But some of us obviously took umbrage with that because it's like false advertising. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, look, you listen to you have to remember that Peaceville Records also starts to come out at the end of the 80s, early 90s, and you have something like Autopsy. And yeah, there's no question that they brought this huge element of doom into the picture. Shortly thereafter, we get Paradise Lost, then My Dying Bride, and Anathema, and this kind of thing. But here's the thing: it's not clean vocals; it's death metal, right? And so, you know, for us, we always perceived it as slow death metal, right? It's like, but I will say this: I personally felt like I related more to those bands than I did to Wretched, for example. You know, just because the Maryland bands weren't that dark per se, right?
I'm glad you brought that point up because I always felt the same way. That a lot of the Maryland bands to me had an element of almost like rock
Yeah,
to them or something. So for those out there, listening, I guess this would be another sort of branch of the Doom tree where the Maryland guys are sort of mixing in this element of just like rock, hard rock type of thing to it. So yeah.
I mean, I think that's where like those bands that Bush was talking about, Bang and Sir Lord Baltimore, and this kind of stuff starts to factor in more, you know. And I don't know, Foghat and whatever. It's like
Yeah.
you kind of like stir all that stuff up, and that's what you get there. But it's a very different thing when you compare that to like the sound of Revelation, right? Revelation, I mean, there's like serious despair in those early records, right? I mean, for me, Never Come Silence is the greatest doom metal album of all time that I can't really listen to, but that's a whole different story, you know. I mean, I don't want to throw any shade because it's for me that album is pivotal, right? There's nothing more. I don't think there's anything more depressing than that, man. I mean, that's where it is at that time, right? And I think that's one of those distinctions where you start getting into the mood and the ambiance and that sincerity of emotion that, look, when you listen to something like Lost Paradise or even Mental Funeral, there's like a sense of dread that doesn't exist on some of these other things. Even, you know, some of the Trouble and Pentagram stuff, it's nowhere near as like bleak as the stuff that was coming out there. However, the point that we take umbrage is like, yeah, look, it's like your cousin or something, right? But it's not really the same thing, you know, in my mind. I see the correlation and I see the relationship, but you know, you got these bands when they're taking in these elements of Celtic Frost and, you know, and probably even Dream Death, honestly, in some cases, right? And stirring that up into like a more extreme variant. That's right. It's like it's another branch. I mean, I'll give you that, but this is all happening, and that stuff actually takes off in a big way. You know, I mean, there's no question that the Peaceville Four make a huge impact on the industry from that point forward, right? And you have these things happening concurrently. You know, all of a sudden you've got that stuff, you've got the handful of epic doom bands, and then you've got the traditional stuff, and then you got Caius and stuff like that coming out of the desert, right? Where, look, again, you could trace it all back to Sabbath, but it's a different thing, you know? It's a different vibe.
Yeah, everything's starting to branch out at this point. You're really seeing it branch out now. You've got the doom death side of it. You've got Caius showing up with the stoner side of it. The Maryland has their own sound. There's the epic sound, and it's all starting to branch out. So then we land at the late 90s to getting into the early 2000s. Is it fair to say that now we start having doom metal bands that are going back and being influenced by Witchfinder General, Saint Vitus, that kind of stuff? So Butch, lead us in out of the 90s into the 2000s.
Well, I think there's no doubt about that. I mean, there's you know, I think with anything, there's bands that you know, a lot of us wear influences on our sleeves, and you can't help but be influenced by music that you grew up with. So if you grew, you know, one of your one of your shows where you were talking about the music you listen to, like you were talking about, like with Martin Popoff,
Yeah.
about there's a certain time period in your life when, when you're a teenager. I go back to this all the time myself. There's that music that influences you at those key moments in your life. You can't help but take it with you. It's always with you. So if you're a kid and you're listening and like, you probably like Sabbath, but maybe you got into Candlemass in the 80s when you were a teenager, and you're going to bring that influence with you. Trouble, I mean, there's no doubt there's bands you can hear the clear influences in the way bands sound and the way they construct their riffs. And there's always our buddy Stump. You might have met him. I'm sure you do. I mean, if you've been out here, and we would like listen to music and be, oh, it's Butch, it sounds like Trouble, or listen to this, it sounds like Pentagram. And I mean, you can hear those things like beyond, like, the Sabbath is obviously there, but you can definitely hear like specific things in these bands that go back to the Pentagrams or the Troubles, Vitus. There's a lot of bands that have a big Vitus influence. I think Reverend Bizzarre is a huge St. Vitus influence. I mean, they have their own thing going on too, but you can't deny that it goes, that the Vitus is in there. And same with Gates of Slumber. And then it's I think with a lot of bands that, there's bands that sound, you can hear, Wino is a huge influence on a lot of guys, and you can hear it in their music. So
Yeah. So Tom, give us some bands from the late 90s, early 2000s that you think were happening at that time that are sort of taking this influence now from, like Butch was talking about, going back now to Trouble and Witchfinder General. You already mentioned a few of them, like the Gates of Slumber. And so who are some other bands from this time frame for the listeners out there?
If you like consider like the Dark Passages bands and, my band and these bands that popped up like in the like 1990 Solstice and Mirror Deception, Dawn of Winter, like that's all kind of like first wave, right? The second wave really starts with stuff like Reverend Bizzarre, no question. And it was a huge impact. And, first of all, again, this is one of those things where we all know each other. We all hung out together, and we certainly embraced it when like these bands like started popping up, right? At least the ones that felt sincere, right? And when you get into say 2003, right? Something around that time, that is when big things are happening in terms of doom metal, and that may be like an apex moment, right? Prior to this, we had Cathedral signing along with a bunch of earache bands to Columbia Records, but that was so horribly mismanaged. Same thing with the Obsessed, that it actually probably did more harm than good. But in the wake of that, the early 2000s, you get Reverend Bizzarre and Place of Skulls. There was a period like, and Butch probably remembers this too, like when, I think it was 2002 was the first real doom metal festival that ever happened, which was Doom Shall Rise in Germany. And we played, both of us, Butch and I, we were at Doom Shall Rise too. It was 2, right, Butch?
I think it was 2. I remember you tipped us off to it. We were playing the Born Too Late festival up in Rochester, and you and I started talking, and we ended up, you ended up probably paving some way for us with Yakin. And so, yeah, it was the second one, and it was you guys, we played it, Orodruin was on, because we had those 2 tours that were crisscrossing.
Right.
The whole time. You guys had Morning Beloveth and While Heaven Wept, and then we had Orodruin and Penance on the road. At the same time.
Yeah. So this is like relevant because remember, like I said, there's this grassroots thing happening, but in the mainstream media, all of a sudden you see Reverend Bizzarre, Place of Skulls, While Heaven Wept, everywhere, right? That's like when we got there, our jaws were dropped because we couldn't believe like anything like this could even happen. Because up to this point, the only really successful doom metal bands were Trouble, Candlemass, and Cathedral, you know, and beyond that, no one cared about anything else in terms of like anything traditional. But around this time frame of 2003 to 2005 or something like that, I think we're seeing like an apex moment. And when you talk about those other bands, it's like, yeah, Orodruin's coming out, Gates of Slumber comes along a little bit later, Reverend Bizzarre, and you know, Victor had started Place of Skulls by this point, out of Pentagram, and I think those bands are major factors. You've got Minotauri out in Finland, and Spiritus Mortis, right? That's kind of like the Finnish trio with Reverend Bizzarre. Thunderstorm from Italy. You know, Mirror Deception and Donner Winter are still going in Germany, but you have more and more bands popping up there, in England as well. You know, there's other bands popping up over there. So, you know, the movement is like at this point snowballing, you know, and becoming like, it's becoming a thing, however briefly, you know, because you know, there's other things happening at the same time, where this is where you also start to see grassroots movements to bring back old school heavy metal, right? That's all happening kind of geostating at the same time. And I'd like to think that the doom metal bands had some role in that, because like you said before, it's very closely related to that kind of stuff, the new wave of British heavy metal and so forth. And it kind of overtook us in a lot of ways, because even though these festivals and this kind of the movement kept going, and there's more and more bands coming along, I think that it was a little bit of a flash in the pan, you know, in a lot of ways. But it was great. Don't get me wrong. It was a blast while it lasted.
Yeah. So, all right. So then we're coming out of the early 2000s. Who are some, you know, let's take us up now, up to the present, sort of. Let's say maybe the last 10 years or so. Who are some newish, last 10 years doom bands that you think are carrying that torch, you know, from those sort of early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s bands, and that scene that you were just talking about, Tom? Who are the bands then that carried the torch after that?
Procession, the Doomsday Cult, which and you're the goat, I guess, to some extent, you know, because it's sort of related. You know, Lord Vicar. You know, honestly, a lot of what's happened since then is it's like those bands from the first wave that ultimately kind of splintered off, broke up, retired, whatever. Some of those folks weren't done, you know, and they went on to start new bands that continued carrying that spirit forward, you know. And I know, like, for example, that you mentioned Argus, right? And there's no one better here to talk about that than Butch. But I will say this, that for me, like, Argus is more than just a doom band. Okay, what we start seeing happening is this kind of fringe development where there are these bands that were influenced by all of the same things that we're talking about, but yeah, you know, they're incorporating a little bit more of the traditional metal into it. Hey, I think you know about this too, actually, right?
Yeah.
So really what ends up happening here is that we start seeing this development of these doom related bands, right? Where it's still in there a little bit, but there's more to it. There's a little bit more diversity to it. You know, maybe there's a little bit more of the Sirathungal side, maybe a little bit more of the new wave of British heavy metal side. And that's really what the byproduct ultimately is. I think, and I embrace it totally, you know. And I mean, that ties into the whole Cruz del Sur music thing. It's like you're looking at these bands where it's like they're almost taking the best of all worlds and keeping it real. Because look, let's be honest, like playing 30 beats per minute for like more than one album is probably too much, you know.
Yeah.
That's what I got out of Doom Shall Rise too, was, man, sitting there watching like 15 bands with Gibson SGs tuned down to C, playing the same stuff like at the same tempo for that many hours in a row. It was fatiguing, honestly, you know. So even us, you know, by the time you get to 2009, you know, and we drop Vast Oceans Lacrimose, it's like, that's not a doom metal record, you know, at all, you know. But there's like little traces of it in there. The emotion is there, right? The weight of it is there. But, you know, look, at this point we've diverged. You know, if I were going to be militant about this, we've gone off on a tangent here. But look, I think that's where some of the best music that we've ever heard has come from, namely August, because who I basically like insisted they needed to be signed by Cruz del Sur Music, because, man, you know, the curse is upon the world. And look, that's where we are today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's true.
So Butch, what do you think in the last 10 years or so? What's some good stuff that you're hearing out there? Where are you seeing doom metal at in the 2010s?
Well, here's the thing with me, and like here's where I have found that actually over the last, I don't know, there was a period of time, you know, probably I joined Penance in the late 90s, and, you know, we did our thing through about 94, 95, and there was a, you know, so it crossed over at a period of time when there was, you know, stuff going on in doom, and I never really stepped away from the scene, and the scene accepted Argus right away, although we never claimed to be a doom band. We just you know, there's elements to it, like, because Andy was, you know, a big Candlemass fan, and we all like big riffs, and, you know, I like double guitars, and there are elements to it, but but it for me, like, I could only do the same. Even when I was in Penance, like, we started diverging right away, and that wasn't me. If it were up to me, we would have been still doing the doomier side of things. But, you know, Mike and Terry, you know, when they were writing, had, you know, you don't want to keep playing the same stuff over and over, and you're going to paint yourself into a corner if you just do the same riff over and over. And so I think, like Tom was saying, things have expanded. Bands that have been around for a long time are looking to do something different. And I think my listening, though, has changed along with it. I mean, it's hard for me anymore to, maybe it's because I'm 49, and it's like, you know, at this point in my life, I've heard so much. It you know, you're always searching for that piece of music that hits you the same way that it did back in the, you know, I'm always looking for that Bastards Will Pay from now that hits me the same way that it did back then, or the Pray for the Dead or something like that. But it's less frequent, and I think there's more bands that I think Stoner Rock kind of overtook things a little bit. There's still doom bands. It's harder for me to find bands that can really keep my attention for long periods of time that are just playing strictly doom. Like the bands I love the most are like I just got the new Witch Hazel record, Pentecost, which is, I think, is brilliant. But would you call it doom? Not. It's doomy. It's got more of a Wishbone Ash kind of vibe to it, and it's, you know, moody is, but, you know, and like you know, While Heaven Wept is, you know, I'd be lying if I didn't say huge impact on me since I've known Tom, but especially starting with Empires and Vast Oceans, and you know, and they've developed a lot, you know, like you know, like Tom was saying, they've definitely stepped away from doom. Do I still include them in the, you know, when I'm talking about the greats in doom? Yeah, but I mean, you can't deny they've changed their, you know, they've expanded what they did. I mean, I think you say Solstices. Yeah, I mean,
all of us have. I mean, if you go back and look at Solitude, even from Beyond the Crimson Horizon to Through to the Darkest Hour, you could hear the change happening. Cathedral, it went from like this doom thing to like Disco Dorian, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then and then beyond that, like Solstice has become almost like this folk metal type of thing. I mean, there was like the Eastern Tour stuff that ultimately led to like more of like a traditional epic metal type of thing, and now there's definitely a much stronger folk element. It's like all of the bands have evolved. I mean, let's talk about that new Pale Divine record, which is phenomenal, but is it a doom metal record? No, not really. I mean, it's in there, there's trace elements, but I mean, I think it's been honestly a long time since we've heard like a real genuine doom metal record other than Orodruin, that, Ruins of Eternity. I mean, when you put that on, it's unmistakable. That's the real deal right there. But now again, look, we're not talking about new bands. We're talking about old bands that have it, always have, and always will. There's like these intangible aspects that even bands that listen to all of us are never going to be able to replicate for several reasons, because they've grown up in a completely different era and environment. They don't know what it was like back in the day. You figure, like, I mean, this is the same people that like look back at like Fate's Warning records that for me are like the greatest metal albums of all time. People dismiss that stuff as like, it's all been done before, but no. And in 1986 it hadn't been.
Hell no, it wasn't.
Yeah, and I would say for, something in the 2000s, you saw some bands going back to the 70s, like I think there were Witchcraft? I forget
Yeah,
what the name of
Witchcraft.
it, like that kind of thing, where they were guys were buying orange amps and deliberately trying to sound as much as they could like the 70s. And for the last 10 years for me, maybe the younger generation, their take on the doom thing, you might see that in like Paul Bearer or Pilgrim, those bands kind of taking, I don't know, where they're at in the stuff that they had been hearing and putting their own sort of thing on it. So all right, well, that takes us up is basically to the present. So before we wrap this up, guys, we'll do a quick go around here. Give the listeners out there what you consider to be 5 essential doom metal bands. For the people out there, go out, listen to these for them to learn about doom metal. Tom, 5 doom metal albums, essential doom metal albums.
You want albums or bands?
Let's do albums. Let's give them a specific, or it could be whatever. It could be either. Because some bands you should just check out all their albums. So
I feel like I'm gonna like say the same things that Butch would anyway. So it's like kind of like a psychic connection here. But I'm gonna say Candlemass, Epicus, Doomicus, Metallicus, right? Trouble, The Skull. Obviously, I have to throw Black Sabbath, Master of Reality in, because that for me is it has some of the darkest and most doomy aspects of Sabbath, and I'll throw the caveat in that if not that, then certainly the first album, the self-titled one. I would say that Pentagram, Relentless, is pretty crucial when all is said and done. And Saint Vitus, I have to go with like the Hallows Victim action personally, but first album, like in any of the like the early stuff, The Walking Dead, any of the stuff from like those first couple albums of Vitus, and for me, like any of that stuff, that's doom metal, period.
Well, you took all of mine, so but you got any other like essential? To me, all those bands you mentioned, those would be. I don't know if you mentioned Witchfinder General. I would throw Witchfinder General in there.
Well, that'd be 66, man.
Yeah, but basically, all those bands that you mentioned there are the crucial, the crucial early doom metal bands. Butch, you got any you want to add?
Well,
for the
I mean, I
people
think
out there?
Tom actually hit a lot of my favorites. You know, the first one off the top of my head is always Troubles the Skull. If we're gonna hit on some bands that I think are, you know, to go beyond, you want to go beyond the big four kind of traditional doom. You know, if you want to really understand the genre, I think you should listen to. I mean, you can take your pick, either Salvation's Answer or Never Come Silence by Revelation. And although I didn't sing on the record, God, I wish I did. I think Parallel Corners by Penance is one of my favorite records of the genre. Honestly, like it's one of those ones I felt honored to be able to sing those songs when we play it. I was always pushing to play more of it. I love that record. If I could adopt it legally, I would.
You should, man. That's an amazing record.
You know, Solitude Aeturnus, for me, I go back and forth between Through the Darkest Hour or Into the Depths of Sorrow. I mean, a big record to listen to. And geez, I mean, you know, I have a hard time picking between I think with not to make you bashful or anything, Tom, but you know, I would go with you know, Vampires Forlorn, From All Heaven Wept, for sure. And you know, I love the new Orodruin record, and I have a hard time, like Epicurean, like has a place in my heart, I think, because you know, when I met those guys and that time period and touring with them when they toured behind that record and hearing those songs like at you know, every night for 2 weeks, and that album is really like, there's just something about that band that even though they've recorded infrequently and you know, but they've always been a presence. And so for me, I think it's a really important record. But of course, the latest record is tremendous and shows a level of songwriting that maybe like is more sophisticated actually than Epicurean Mass. But again, it's like, what did you hear first? And yeah, the impact that record had on me at the time is immense.
And if you're going to talk about Orodruin, I got to throw my jam Claw Tower out there. That should be played more often, man. That's
that's a great riff for sure. All right. Well, I would like to thank Tom and Butch for joining me here today at the Laird. Thank you, guys. And
great to see you, man.
Thank you. And I will be putting in the description down below some links to the various projects that Tom and Butch are in and have been involved in. I'm also going to put a list down below, some of these, a lot of these bands that we talked about, so people out there can go and check out these bands and learn more about doom metal. This was an awesome discussion going through the whole history of doom metal all the way back to Black Sabbath and taking us up to the present. So thank you again, guys. Everybody out there, leave some comments down below. Let us know if you're a doom metal fan. Let us know doom bands that you might like. Of course, we couldn't talk about every single band that came out. I think we touched on all the biggies, but I'm sure in the comments, people will let us know who we might have missed. So, okay.
5 minutes from now, we'll be saying, why didn't I talk about that band?
Yeah, I mean, I'm already sitting there thinking, going, you know, there was another important album, which is Warning. You know,
right.
That's
all right. Well, this just means we're going to have a part 2 to this. We're going to have to have a part 2 to this discussion, because this was a blast. I really enjoyed myself.
We can like get deeper into like those more obscure albums, maybe, you know, that aren't the obvious, like maybe the next level. If you want to go, once you're done with those 10, 12 albums we talked about, we can talk about like the others that are crucial since then.
That's right. So you listeners out there, you have your homework. You got to go get these essential bands down first, because we're coming back at you and we're going to be digging deeper and deeper into the doom. So, all right. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everybody out there. Until we see you again, make sure you all stay heavy and stay metal.